Oh, welcome to another sequence, another episode of Reflections with A Course in Miracles. And that means to let ourselves be reflected by Christ Himself with all that comes into our perspective, all that we are dreaming here. And of course, we are being helped, and that help shows up as our brother. And that help is, of course, also the voice that we receive and listen and hear in our own mind. And it is the perspective of what we are practicing with the daily lessons. My mind holds only what I think with God, that we come to know that there isn't really anything else that we could call real or valuable besides what we hear in with the voice of God, and think literally in His mind and as an extension of His mind. And we are in that being helped and accompanied, of course, also being given very gently by Jesus Christ in His Course in Miracles. Here few points and hints so that we don't fall again and again and again into the same trap. And so it is great actually to look at certain passages, sentences, sometimes just words of a lesson or introduction to the lesson, and see how the entire transformation is really included in such an expression. And that came to me when I reviewed the sequence where I find myself now, the introduction of the lessons, for the lessons 141 to 150. And it is pretty much at the very end, the second last paragraph, and where he brings that together, thoughts. My thought, my mind is supposed and is indeed thinking with the mind of God. And my mind holds only what I think with God. So we are given with daily lessons, daily ideas like, I will not value what is valueless, let me perceive forgiveness as it is here on the uh, review of in the lesson 147. But then really to remember to not add any other thoughts in that practice, in that moments of remembering, being in His mind united. And it is true that we think only a thought of light and love, in which we touch where we are at in the textbook also, where we come to know, where we touch knowledge, I wanted to say, where there's knowledge revealed to us is much better expression. And so in that introduction, he simply says, we add no other thoughts, but we let these be the messages they are. We simply allow, without any resistance, to be those sentences, those messages given from out of time, be our guidance in also in coming to a trust that this works when we work it. And we need not know more than this to give us happiness and rest and endless quiet. And here it is also what I want to make emphasis of: perfect certainty, because it is only the perfect certainty that comes from that help from God, from knowledge itself. And he continues, and all our Father wills that we receive as the inheritance we have of him. So it is quite a list, isn't it? And if you can really check it and see if there's anything missing for you, so go ahead. Happiness, rest, endless quiet, a stillness that is eternal silence, you could say. Perfect certainty, all your Father wills that you receive as your inheritance that he has for you. Each day of this times of this practicing, we close as we begin repeating first the thought that made the day a special time, a blessing, and of happiness for us, and through our faithfulness restored the world from darkness to the light, from grief to joy, from pain to peace, from sin to holiness. These are the descriptions of the actions of mind, of what we are really doing here in not doing. We allowing and a conversion of limited thought forms, of illusions, to happen and be brought to the truth itself, to reality. When the idea of separation is brought to the recognition of oneness, when the idea of dark imagery as what the world reflects within the human mind is brought to a light experience that doesn't come and go and doesn't show any impermanence, that is literally the thought that thinks with God, remembers what it is, who we are. And this is what is offered in these review lessons. My mind holds only what I think with God. And as we find ourselves in looking at perception and what perception was used for, or how perception is indeed corrected by our turning to that mind that thinks with God and doesn't hold anything less than what the truth of creative extension is, then we are looking at how perception has to be changed and is changed. And we are looking at what the perspective is that we have experienced in an instant out of time, where knowledge itself that is of God has revealed itself in us, and how this knowledge now extends by itself, clarifies by itself into a self-recognition of who we are as God created us. And so we find ourselves in the Foundations edited version in chapter 3 in the section 4, and we finished last time the first 4 paragraphs and will continue here. And if you're using the complete and annotated version, we are in the same chapter 3 in section 6, and we completed the first 7 sections, 7 paragraphs. And so I want definitely to bring here this original version in, because where we left it, that is how Helen Schuckman was receiving it, that we are talking here also about certain, let's say, companions on the way home that were psychotherapists and psychoanalysts. And we were already mentioning Carl Jung the last time, and this time he will again look at Sigmund Freud, and we looked in a previous episode at Edgar Cayce, remember? And so the value isn't that we really get to know where they were in their own learning and understanding at that time. I mean, we are talking here about that goes back more than 100 years. But the value might lie as in all those perspectives where it becomes personal, where it was originally directed to Helen and to Bill, to really find those parts in ourselves and to see that yes, there is an evolution that has occurred over these more than 100 years, and certain things that most probably were kind of very progressively understood at that time is almost seen like a mistake, an error that we can laugh right now because it is so obvious and so clear that this wouldn't be a real demonstration of the truth. So that shows also that we have come a long way, and on that long way, we have undergone certain experiences that are so huge and immense that we can really be immensely grateful to what has been given us, to what has opened up in our mind and understanding, even within the conceptual mind, in that part of the consciousness, and that we have arrived at a very clear understanding that there is no solution in any conceptual understanding, but that the solution is represented by singular experience or an experience of singular reality within ourselves. And of course, it cannot not be that the world as it is seen and perceived is simply seen and recognized in its meaninglessness. You could also say in the experience, it is actually completely seen like that, how it disappears, how it isn't being seen at all. And this is where knowledge comes in, or where we where we are in knowledge, where we touch knowledge. And even if a perception of the world and of our fellow travelers come back, we have the certainty of what has been given us in this moment. And that certainty cannot really be practiced, because that certainty is either present or it is not present. And it is only present when we are in contact, in direct contact with what makes God, what is of God. So I'm using these words very consciously because I'm talking here about the aspects of love and light and happiness as we were just sharing it from the introduction of the lesson. And so it is very clear. I just shared that yesterday in this great Miracles Festivals that is celebrated and organized in Germany. And there are some English-speaking teachers also invited, so everyone is welcome to tune in there. It is the website of Wonder, which is Miracle Wonder Festival.de, and Wonder slash not slash dash festival.de. And so in my session yesterday, I was bringing that in because the theme is the blossoming in Christ, or you come into bloom, you flourish in Christ consciousness, and how that is really experienced. And we know it from the past also, when we are in love, when we touch love, when we are in love where there is no future and no past, when we live and experience love without an opposite, without a fear, without any conditions, without any second thoughts. And of course, everyone of us here has such experience, and those experiences increase and increase and strengthen by their increase. And so our experience of really seeing that as a flourishing of that connection of the consciousness in love and through love, or even just in moments of being or falling in love, is really a connection to that certainty of which we are talking here about. And that certainty in that connection of coming into our Christ self is, of course, depending on that is received of that quality of God, of love itself. And so being or living in love, we also very clearly see that there's no space, or there's nothing left that would lack anything. Any idea of lack is still on the timeline looking for an outcome in another time, at another time, for a better outcome of the situation in which one finds itself. And such perspective is definitely not of that love of which we speak of. But when we also investigate in our mind and look from the perspective, well, what were we, or what was I really lacking in that staying in separation, or staying in the denial, in that pushing literally singular reality away? What was lacking was the love experience. And so now that love is introduced and given us completely from above, from God's mind itself. And so that love is an all encompassing love. And therefore, a mind that accepts that. And I'm inviting you right now and myself to live that, relive it, remember it right now, because it doesn't matter if it looks like we are in distant or online or in different countries or on different locations. It doesn't really matter. There's nobody anywhere. Everyone is only in my mind here where I am, in your mind where you are right now. And that is the fact of the matter. There is nobody outside ourselves. Outside ourselves is what we call nothing. And so being in that experience of love is present is also an experience that we have needed, or we needed to learn the acceptance of love, to accept to be loved, and to live that in our daily coming together might make or appear as problematic. But when we meet our Savior, when we meet the Master himself, when we meet our true self, okay, the self that is literally the extension of the Holy Spirit and doesn't sees everything, but knows perfectly well that none of it has anything to do with reality. And that self, or that coming as a manifestation in the dream as the Master himself, the one teacher, right? The Master himself. And you can call him as you like. I call him Christ Jesus. But if you call him Krishna, or in any other religion as the name of the Savior, Mohammed, or whatever, it would be absolutely the same in my mind. So that shows also, when we really come from a singular experience, we do not no longer distinguish in appearances how it is manifesting in our consciousness, or is taught in religious expressions. It becomes really a self-recognition, and that all the time. And it must come from a gift that has touched us so profoundly that it literally was presenting us a completely newness, a new continuum, a new time, a rebirth. And you know what I'm talking about it when you share that same experience with me. Indeed, the moment you hear that, you are sharing the same experience with me. And so I can maybe just share where I found myself in the beginning of my transformation, and then really getting eager and asking for help, and uh, getting ready for, yes, uh, I'm I'm ready that it is being revealed to me who I really am, and it is shown to me that this world I think I am in isn't even there, and will disappear. So in this, at that time of me being completely willing to go along and meet my true self, meet the master, of course it could not happen. And in many occasions I might not have been really aware of it, that he was already present, as he presented himself, of course, throughout all times. But the moment my mind was focusing on it, or opening up is maybe the better expression, opening up to receive him, to see him, to allowing him to come into my heart and soul and mind. For me, it really then happened with Eastern associations when I found myself in India, traveling in India. And I had there many such incidences and experiences, but some of them, of course, were clearer, or maybe even from the perspective of perception, because we are talking here about the conversion of perception, where a perception of light and love can be so intense and so strong that there isn't really anything else to be seen, that anything that is still as a reflection of the world being seen is also recognized as completely transparent, literally, and having no meaning whatsoever in regard to truth and reality. And so, what happened to me personally, and you might have had a similar or same experience, was that I found myself in visiting, and she's still around. She lives in India, Amritananda Mai, and just being there in that presence where this reunion occurred. It was like in a bamboo hut, I remember, at the sea, and but just that feeling and experiencing that perceiving of that strength of light and love was my time where a complete letting go could occur. In that sense, I fell apart with any perspective of, I thought, what makes up a human being, as I called myself. And so that opening of the emotional heart also, which was part of that, going into the spiritual heart, was in that sense, in other word using words, in other expressions, it's called to bottom out in the 12-step program. Like you penetrate literally your bottom of your self-concept, and you bottom out means you come out reborn on the other side. And so for me, that was a complete emotional release for the at first, just for kind of half an hour. And I was even walking outside, so do not disturb anybody there. And I was there behind this this hut, crying and completely releasing my human self. And when I went back in, and she had like a big smile looking at me, she knew exactly, of course, what happened to me. It was, of course, that way as I was just describing it before. It was a complete seeing these images of the world in a different way. And of course, I had then repetitive experiences when I was around in the ashram of Osho, and then later on for many years with Bunchaji, with Papaji, where really the entire self, as even the one who is in that experience, got completely lost and released in all there is, in the, you could say, into the entire universe as I experienced it, and or a complete disappearance, maybe is even a better expression. So I'm kind of hesitant sharing these experiences because everybody gives it meaning, whatever um, is in their own mind, and it's very easily then made an idol. And we are not here to demonstrate anything that happened to us that it is an idol, because never forget that our transformation and how we wake up from the dream is in that, as long as there is a personal observed experience, very, very, very personal. And even if we share certain processes or how it comes in appearance, and in that letting go, in that, or going through the channel to the light, and or how the kundalini arises, and there are similarities there, but how it is really personally experienced, no one can really describe it or explain it by still using words or expressions of human consciousness, because it is brought in onto a level where we share perception, and it goes always beyond perception. Never forget that. But to come back to what we were talking about, the certainty that comes in these experiences is really what we can say is a gift that we share in our coming together. And another sequence of such clear self-recognition and experience I had then coming to the academy to Wisconsin with Dear One, as we called him, the master teacher of A Course in Miracles. And there was even then more the direction and evidence given, and the sharing about the message of what the Course is giving, or is the message for the world, and we are giving to the world. And so if that comes from a certainty within me, within us, it immediately becomes a demonstration of so much more than what words could mean. It becomes literally a light extension, an experience of sharing of the love of God. And this is really where we find ourselves. And here's also all my gratitude to you, to every brother, to the message of the Course, because where there's certainty in our own mind, we know that it is not something that really is in connection with the dream and the world, but certainty that comes from God is where we can say, where the love and the light is literally resting in certainty. And this is also how Jesus expresses it in chapter 22, that love rests in the certainty. And when we ask for that help, when we don't live it yet in certainty, when the human mind is still asking for that guidance or for that revelation, then of course we direct ourselves to a higher power. We direct our mind to Christ. We direct our mind to the Holy Spirit. And we will and we want to ask Him then to join us there. And this is also the promise that Jesus has given us. So, and it just needs that invitation to join me there, my friend Christ. Join with me and share that certainty. Give me that certainty. It is a gift literally of whole mind. And I cannot really explain how it works, but I know that it is almost like a transmission that dawns in the consciousness when the mind becomes certain. But it is a different certainty than being certain within the dream. I'm certain this soup is too salty, right? That's a certainty within the human consciousness. And it is so much more because it is a certainty of who I am, who you are, who we all are. It is a certainty of what truth is. Don't forget that. And so it is a certainty that our certainty comes from that stillness, that inner stillness, that quietness, that peace, that love, that light experience. And it is given by God Himself. And you find then, where we will arrive in about a few weeks in lesson 168, now by grace, your grace is given me, I claim it now, where he says that God speaks to you and His grace that He is perfect and is accessible, and He loves you, He loves His Son, and there is no other certainty than His love for me, for you, for His Son. And that this suffices, this is enough. This is what this lesson talks about. And this is really the expression now to bridge it into, with that long introduction, into where we find ourselves in that chapter 3 unedited version, where he very lengthy describes and shares with us how to get to knowledge, or how knowledge is being revealed, or how in that undoing of perception, knowledge is really where we are in certainty. So where we left it the last time, he starts out talking about Freud, and I will just go along and read this with you and see how we connected with what we were just sharing. Again, thank you for being present here. Thank you for your interest in that, because, of course, what else would we do, and what other interests satisfy us, and what other interest would we want to share than what we know as truth coming forth from the depths of our being. And so he says here that Sigmund Freud, right, gave a very graphic but upside down account of how the divisions of the mind arose from the bottom up. So how it was developing from you. I'm not sure if I understand it correctly. I will see if here in the complete and annotated version, Robert Barry gave an expression to that. Yes, he gave a commentary to that. And he said that the ego developed like a skin over the unconscious, and he believed that the ego developed from the identity which is in the conscious, and then the super ego developed from the ego. So for him, the structure of the psyche grew upward out of the unconscious. But Jesus says that it happened the other way around. A choice to separate made in the superconscious gave birth to the conscious mind, and then the conscious mind's act of pushing material outside of it gave birth to the unconscious. Well, whatever. We have great ideas about everything, isn't it? I'm just keep on. So I understand it that it comes basically from the mind where the core concepts in the self concepts are, and what we call the unconscious, and where it rises upwards. Actually, this is impossible here, Jesus says, because so from the rising from the bottom up, because the unconscious cannot create the conscious. You cannot create something you can't know. So here's a clear alignment given, that we start with who we are and what comes from knowledge, and that what comes from knowledge is coming or is in consciousness, becomes consciousness, and everything is consciousness. And therefore, even that part that is put into unconsciousness is part of the consciousness. It's just a matter of time to open that up and see that the mind can be or becomes conscious of those parts that were hidden in unconsciousness. Freud was greatly worried about this, being very bright, though misguided, Jesus says here, and attempted to get around it by introducing a number of borderline areas which merely resulted in fussiness. This was particularly unfortunate because he was capable of going much higher if he hadn't been so afraid. This is kind of, oh my God, like here, Jesus, you understand also on those parts we were discussing that before, that um, these parts were kind of edited out of the new edition so that it doesn't look like that Jesus would judge his brothers. But it has not really anything to do with judgment. It's basically an alignment and an offer of correction and showing, hey, look, you have the same tendency, you're doing those same things. Don't repeat the same error, don't fall into the same trap. That's how I understand it. It's basically giving an example of not repeating the littleness or staying in littleness. This is why he kept pulling the mind down. The ego did not arise out of the unconscious. A lower order perception cannot create a higher order one. That is really the teaching, and we have accepted that in accepting his teaching. And in parentheses, then it is stated, which is the way you perceive the structure of the psyche if you look at it from the bottom up, because it doesn't understand it. The lower order perception cannot create a higher one because it doesn't understand it. But a higher order perception can create a lower order one by understanding it in terms of misperception. Here, misperception comes in. Here, that's a misperception is a perception with a limited meaning given and held in that context, and then being said, now I know what is real or what it is. Perception always involves some misuse of will. That is, or mind, you could say here. That is what was expressed then as mind. Perception always involves some misuse of will because it involves the mind in areas of uncertainty. See, when we talk about certainty, uncertainty needs to be understood also and literally let go of or given him for correction. The mind is very active because it has willpower. Never forget that. Your mind has always willpower. That is what is given by creation itself. Power of mind is also power of will. When it willed, the separation. See, it is mostly so expressed how it has occurred and and there are wonderful concepts around it. But who is really bringing it to the point that this was a conscious will decision within one's own mind? It is not something that generally occurred and you were part of it, okay? And then you suffered along with. No, no, you chose that. You decided that. You used your will for experiencing yourself in separation. And that is really an advanced consciousness when it can take that responsibility that it didn't come from somewhere else or some other mind, because it's always pushed away. Well, I know I was never the ego and therefore it couldn't come from me. No, if there was ego, then it was me, it was you. And, and if there is ego still to be seen, then we still have to look at it, what ego thoughts are left to be and being brought to correction. When it willed the separation, that mind, it willed to perceive. That's where it started. That's where perception comes in. That's where perception became real, where separation was experienced. Until it chose to do this, it willed only to know. So here's the clarity that knowledge is our natural inheritance. Knowledge is what we are. Knowledge is the direct connection with God's mind. And so everything that has been chosen, that has been decided to experience beyond knowledge in its limitation, is really what perception is. And therefore, perception is brought back for the undoing process to be translated or opened up again into knowledge. That's how you can understand it. Afterwards, it had to will ambiguously, and the only way out of ambiguity is clear perception. Or you could then say the new perception, healed perception, forgiven perception. The ego is as frail as Freud perceived it. The later theorists have tried to introduce a less pessimistic view, but have looked in the wrong direction for their hope. Any attempt to endow the ego with the attributes of the soul is merely confused thinking. An attempt to endow the ego with attributes of the soul capitalized, like that would be with real mind, right? With the mind that thinks with God, the mind that holds nothing but what it thinks with God. So to and try to endow the ego with attributes of your right mind, we could also say, is here, Jesus calls it, is confused thinking. Freud was more clear-sighted about this because he knew a bad thing when he perceived it, but he failed to recognize that a bad thing cannot exist. So he didn't go all the way into the direct experience where he could see that what he experienced as a bad thing wasn't really there. For us, it seems to be very common and very natural now with this mind training and with these course in miracles. But at that time, it wasn't. Continuing. It is therefore wholly unnecessary to try to get out of it. As you very rightly observed yourself, the thing to do with a desert is to leave, right? If you find yourself in the desert of your mind and there's nothing there, just sand and wind, and you're looking for water and you don't find anything, you're gonna leave the desert. That's the only thing you have to do. So that same is with the ego mind, with that barrenness that the conceptual ego mind really represents, or it has as its basis. You have to leave it. The mind returns itself to its proper function only when it wills to know. So, we all pray, thy will be done, Father. No? But we have to remember that our will is done along with God's will. And when my will is to know, then of course it is revealing, it is given, it is shown. Again, the mind returns itself to its proper function only when it wills to know. This places it in the soul's service, where perception is meaningless. And I use this today as the title, where perception is meaningless. This is where we are in the higher service, in the service of the right-minded expression, closeness to God, in the certainty that we are receiving His gift. And so that the gift that comes from God is always knowledge. So here's the connection where we start to understand that perception is meaningless, and where we start to experience that we cannot proceed with our perceptions and the meanings we have given it. That's really where the mind becomes open and being willing that knowledge is being revealed. Now from here he starts already to introduce the word superconscious, that has then later on, when it was brought in the edited version as spirit, it was then translated. But why not use this psychological expression? The superconscious is the level of the mind which wills to do this. Freud was particularly distorted on this point because he was getting too far up for comfort according to his own perception. But he was right in the maintaining that the parts, under quotes, of the psyche cannot be correctly perceived either as things or as entirely separate. He would have thought better if he had said entirely separated. The mind did divide itself when it willed to create its own levels and the ability to perceive them. So here are the expressions, how the universe came about, how the dream of separation came about, how separation became a perceived reality. The mind did divide itself, and it divided itself when it willed, when that mind put its will in it to create its own levels. What was the first level to create? To experience I am existing. I exist because there is no sense of existence in God's mind. So the wish uh, to experience, to be here as an existing being, was really the first level of separation. When it willed to create its own levels and the ability to perceive them, but it could not entirely separate itself from the soul, from its source, because it is from the soul that it derives its whole power to create. So that was the connection to God's mind, was still there, in other words. Even in miscreating, will is affirming its source, so that there is something expressed as willpower, affirms actually from where that willpower comes from, and that comes from your source, that comes from the soul itself. Or it would merely cease to be. This is impossible because it is part of the soul, which God created, and which is therefore eternal. So those are very clear and beautiful expressions, aren't they? The ability to perceive made the body possible because you must perceive something and with something. This is why perception involves an exchange or a translation, which knowledge does not need. Knowledge doesn't need to be translated in higher knowledge or any other type of knowledge. Knowledge is knowledge, but perception needs to be exchanged, to be translated into knowledge. The interpretive function of perception, actually a distorted form of creation, then permitted man to interpret the body as himself, which, although depressing, was a way out of the conflict he induced. So you see, here it came then the body identification, body identity. And this has already been covered in some details. The superconscious, which knows, could not be reconciled with this loss of power because it was incapable of darkness. This is why it became almost inaccessible to the mind and entirely inaccessible to the body. It was perceived as a threat because light does abolish darkness by establishing the clear fact that it isn't there. The truth will always destroy error in this sense. It will always reveal that it isn't there. This is not an active process of destruction at all. We have already emphasized the fact that knowing does not do anything. It can be perceived as an attacker, but it cannot attack. When man perceives as its attack is his own recognition of the fact that it can always be remembered because it has never been destroyed. This is not a literal remembering as much as a remembering, re-membering, bringing it together, the members. Wow. And then he added here on, in parentheses, largely for Bill, I wish he would decide to use the talent of his constructively. He has no idea of how powerful it could be. Actually, it doesn't come from the unconscious and is really a distorted form of miraculous perception, which he has reduced to word twisting. Although this can be quite funny, it is still a real waste. Maybe he would care to let me control it and still use it humorously himself. He doesn't have to decide it is one or the other. So those were like hints that Jesus gave, both of them. Let's finish up that section. Now he is talking about the unconscious. The unconscious should never have been reduced to, as it is called, a container for the waste products of conflict. Even as he perceives his psyche, every level has a creative potential because nothing man creates can wholly lose this. Beautiful, isn't it? It's so everything can still be used for a demonstration of the creative potential that is in everyone, in everything, in every expression. God and the souls he created remain in surety, or we were talking about certainty, it's the same, and therefore know that no miscreation exists. Truth cannot deal with unwilling error because it doesn't will to be blocked out. But I was a man who remembered the soul and its knowledge. Tell Bill, tell him, or you're told that when he refused to misperceive, he was indeed behaving as I behaved. And as a man, I didn't attempt to counteract error with knowledge so much as to correct error from the bottom up. I demonstrated both the powerlessness of the body and the power of the mind by uniting my will with that of my Creator, which naturally remembered the soul and its own real purpose. Very important expression because it tells how we want to go along in our transformation of thought forms and where the mistakes were made. And here Jesus gives from his own personal experience. I will review it once more. As a man, I did not attempt to counteract error with knowledge, to like to really go over it and just uh, smush it, wipe it off the table, and just, well, it isn't there or it's not real. And so he didn't do that. So much as to correct error from the bottom up. I demonstrated both. I demonstrated, he said, the powerlessness of the body and the power of the mind by uniting my will with that of my Creator. It's always about that, to unite our will with God's will, which naturally remembered the soul and its own real purpose, its singular purpose. I cannot unite your will with God's for you, but I can erase all misperceptions from your mind if you will bring it under my guidance. So this is an expression. He's always available. He's always there. He's always accessible. He's always literally your transformer. You just need to ask him. Just need to ask him for his guidance. Only your misperceptions stand in your own way. Without them, your own choice is certain. Sane perception induces sane choosing. The atonement was an act based on true perception. I cannot choose for you, but I can help you make your own right choice. Those are his words. And here come the very popular and famous expressions. Many are called, but few are chosen, should read. All are called, but few choose to listen. Therefore, they do not choose aright. So that sentence from the Bible, many are called, but few are chosen, is now translated into a broader offer and clearer understanding that everyone, all are called, but few choose to listen, and therefore they do not choose right. The chosen ones are merely those who choose right sooner. And we can add on now is the time. The moment you choose now, you belong to the chosen ones. This is the real meaning of the celestial speed up. The master teacher used this expression to the celestial speed up. There was a whole series there with his videos. Strong wills can do this now. Here it is. Only a strong will can choose now. And you will find rest for your souls. God knows you only in peace, and this is his reality. And then there was just a note added on that the term insight, though referring to lofty perception, is not an attribute of knowledge. This is why terms like lofty are meaningless in this context. Insight is not the way to knowledge, but it is a prerequisite for knowledge. And you could say, we're using in German also the word intuition, intuition, and that would be like also insight. Those are prerequisites for knowledge. Being of God, knowledge has nothing to do with your perceptions at all. That is why it can only be a gift of God to you. So we leave it with this for today. This is huge. This is great. And you see, we are looking at really how perception came about. It was like how the world was made up. And we become very clear by using his teaching, how it is translated into knowledge. And that knowledge is really our only inheritance. And we are touching that knowledge always when we let go completely of the past, when we let go of the meanings that we have given it, when we receive and accept God's gifts, which are no less than love, light, happiness, peace. Thank you, brother. Thank you for listening. You have a most wonderful day, evening, wherever you are, whenever you tune in here. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to Voice from Heaven, live in the Miracles Healing Center.